Welcome to the Education Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsor, Limmer Education, we can make science more accessible and understandable.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August 2023 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club. Thanks for joining us. If you did last week, we were live at the National Association of EMS Educators Symposium with Kim McKenna. And this week, we're back to our regular programming. As you know, the PCRF, we promote research literacy to advance the science of EMS educational research. So here with the PCRF Journal Club, we're going to take a closer look at some of the research that's happening in medical education. First, a big thank you to Limmer Education for sponsoring these podcasts so we can bring you the best of science in education. I'm Megan Corey, and I'm here with a big panel today. We got a nice group. We've got Michael Cadus, we've got Katie O'Connor, David Page. We've got a guest panelist today, Dr. Kimberly Witten-Chung, who is joining us, who recently published her dissertation on simulation. So we'll be bringing her in a little bit. Probably Dr. Bill Toon will be joining us. And we are going to discuss this article today entitled Simulation-Based Training and Its Use Amongst Practicing Paramedics and EMTs, or Emergency Medical Technicians, an evidence-based systematic review. And this was published just this year, January to March edition of the International Journal of Paramedicine. So welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. Remember, one little reminder, too, that you can use the chat feature. You can post your questions in the Q&A. We can bring those into the conversation as we go. You can talk amongst yourselves in the chat. And remember, if you ever miss anything, or maybe you get called away and you'd like to come back to this conversation, you can go to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@PCRF at UCLA, and you can also subscribe, and that way you don't miss any of our journal clubs, whether they're with Dr. Emily Crow and Tony Fernandez, or this one here on education. So let's get to this article. And in what we're going to do, because we've got a nice big panel today, is I want to start by first having our guest panelist, Dr. Kimberly Witten-Chung, come on and introduce herself and your background. First of all, congratulations on your publication of your dissertation this year. That's a huge, huge accomplishment. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a labor of love, but great to be through. I am currently the Director of Operations for the Center of Healthcare Education and Simulation at Pikes Peak State College. I oversee the simulation of our nursing department and our allied health programs. And I've been doing simulation, and I'm a certified healthcare simulation educator. And I've been doing simulation for about 18 years.
That's great. Congratulations on your dissertation. Tell us a little bit about what you studied.
Sure. So my dissertation topic was directors' perceptions of supplementing clinical requirements with simulation-based education in paramedic education. So the topic was looking at the perceptions of Colorado paramedic program directors and how they felt about using simulation-based education in place of the COA clinical requirements. And so I had 4 research questions, and each one of those research questions were able to be broken down into themes to answer those research questions. I think that we ended up with some pretty good, data. The Colorado paramedic program directors are were very forthcoming with information, and I did a qualitative study, so that allowed me to pull themes out of the information, out of the semi-structured interviews that I conducted with those program directors. And so even though I had the independent interviews with the program directors, I had emergent themes as a result of the codes, and was able to have some very meaningful information that came out of that.
So tell us what I know this is
Certainly.
about a different article, but what did you find?
Okay, so I didn't want to take too much time. However,
That's okay.
I'm
we
happy
have
to
an
be
hour.
able to share. So the first question that I asked was just very broadly, what are the perceptions that our program directors had about supplementing simulation-based education with for clinical education? And I had 3 emergent themes as a result of that. The first one was simulation and clinical education needs to be used in combination. And as that came up, I was kind of, obviously that seems very apparent to us. However, one of the things that I suspect you guys have discussed in this forum is that we have a significant lack of publication in EMS everything, right? We don't publish. And so having this theme emerge is novel. I actually, in all of the research articles that I've seen, it's not there. And so it's meaningful that this has come up from the Colorado paramedic program directors as an emergent theme, because no one else has published this information. So the second theme was that simulation cannot replace some clinical experiences. So it's obviously important that our students continue to see patients, right? Like, we cannot put all of our paramedic students into a simulation-based education experience and think that they're going to be prepared to go be entry-level paramedics. Mm-hmm. And then finally, for the first research question, there are common opportunities for simulation-based clinicals, such as are high acuity, low frequency patients. And so if we do well-developed simulation, we can effectively educate our students and replace those clinical opportunities. You want me to go through all the research questions?
No, this is good. Actually, this is a good start.
Perfect.
We can pull some of them in as we go here.
Excellent.
But you've worked with nursing, and we know that in nursing research, there was the large Hayden study by the NCSBN, many years ago that looked at, they were actually after kind of a specific number, which can advise states and programs, of course, of boards of registered nursing, as to how much you can supplement without it affecting your student outcomes and actually clinical outcomes. They went all the way to clinical outcomes. They looked at practicing nurses. So that was a real big study that we should be looking at in EMS as well. So I wanted to move through our panel and just ask if you can give a minute on your simulation experience, so everyone knows where we're coming from when we attack this article. Talk about this article, discuss this article. Katie, how about you? We know you, but a little bit about your experience with simulation. Where are you coming from? What's your lens when you approach this article?
Yeah, I'm primarily a simulation educator and in primary education. So I started simulation in EMS and in nursing education, and that's what I do now, and mostly in paramedics. So I'm coming at it from the primary education in simulation.
And you were on the NASCL. You were the paramedic representative, right? On the new standards?
The EMS representative for the NASCL standards, which are the standards for simulation that are used. It's called a NASCL, which is a little nursing in there, but really adopted by the Society for Simulation in Healthcare across all fields.
Yeah, which is awesome. David Page is on too. David is traveling, but we've got you on. You've had a long history of simulations. In fact, I remember watching a very a couple of critical presentations you did many years ago with Heather Davis and with others on how to, Dennis Edgerly, on how to conduct low fidelity, highly effective simulations.
Thank you. So yeah, it's only been 35 plus years. So I'm still learning, which might depress some people who are just starting, but I do feel like science evolves and changes, and it's really fun and interesting to kind of go, oh, what we did back then was working or it didn't work. And I helped develop the current COE recommendations around language to describe the with you, Megan, of course, and others, to describe what we would call a simulation dictionary, and hopefully begin to describe things in a similar language as the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, which Katie was just talking about. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. I've got all sorts of pointy edges to discuss.
Yeah, thanks. Michael Cadus joins us from UCLA.
Good morning, everybody. Michael Cadus, UCLA. I'm the EMT program director here. We're the largest program of EMT primary education in the US, about 1,000 students through. Thrilled to have implemented several great simulations as both part of our skills lab, and even some scenarios where they get dispatched out of a lecture to go respond to a call, and we zoom it back to the classroom. So thrilled to be joining and reviewing this research.
Yeah, this is great because that's one of the points that will come out of, there is a comment, I think, in the discussion section about EMT, and it is an area that we need to discuss a little bit more in terms of EMT and simulation rather than EMT and checkbox skills that so many people are still reliant on. But yep. Okay, so what I want to do next is I'm going to reference what Kim said earlier, which
Megan,
was
Alex is here too. He joined a little late, but Alex Tremblay's here. He's our
I can't see his name on here. Alex, are you here?
Oh, yeah, I'm here. Yeah. My Zoom had to update.
Okay.
Oh,
no.
I apologize to be a couple minutes late.
I forgot to press the arrow. I actually still see Bill Toon too. There's an arrow. You guys all don't fit. Okay, go ahead, Alex.
No problem. I, like Dave, am still learning, but not for nearly as long. I work at an ambulance service in a training capacity. I currently precept students, and recently as last year was responsible for some grant funding to move us from low fidelity to high fidelity simulation at the service. So that's my experience.
And you have experience with the practicing, right? The practicing paramedic and EMT. So yep. That's a real distinction that we're going to have to really outline. It took me 3 reads through this to figure out that we were not talking about school, and some of that comes from my perspective, which is being in initial education, but not realizing this was actually not about initial training. Dr. Bill Toon, can you hear us, and can you give us your background on simulation?
Hi there. Nice to see everyone on. I'm looking very forward to seeing what Katie has to say about everything today. Mm-hmm. I consider her our simulation guru. And Dave Page, round out those points, and let's not talk too much. So probably the greatest use I had of simulation was when I did continuing education for 20 years in Kansas. And we certainly did not begin with any really good simulation, but towards the end of our time there, we found a way to use models that were appropriately coached and scripted, along with good moulage and equipment that we could modify towards that, so we could really develop and get better simulation. And of course, the people in the field always enjoyed doing anything that was simulation based over any task work or listening to any kind of presentation. So there's my experience with simulation.
Great. I think it's hard to find anybody in EMS education who hasn't had some experience with simulation. Even they may not even say it because they think, well, I've just been running these ad hoc scenarios. But we have really relied upon this. Even that level, we would consider, a type of simulation. So cast a wide net. And if you're out there and you're wondering about definitions, we use terms fidelity. You use all different types of terms. What David Page mentioned earlier, there is, and even if you're not in a paramedic education program, if you're in another level, go to the COE EMSP site and look up the simulation standards. or recommendations, and you can look at all of the definitions, or and there's references and links to some of the things that Katie mentioned, which is the dictionary around simulation. That's a great place to start, so you kind of get an idea of what we're talking about, because I was a little bit confused in this study. So this was they reference, and in this study, which the reason why the COA EMSP language comes into it is because they frequently reference this, during COVID-19, the statement or the amendment to the standards that the COA EMSP, and many states frankly did too, amended their standards so that they had more flexibility for programs who were losing clinical sites for their students, or for, that's what's so confusing, because COA and standards, and we think paramedic programs, but the study itself was really on practicing paramedics. It's right in the title, and EMTs. But the statement they're talking about is the use of alternative evaluation methods that was allowed by the COA. So this study is a systematic review of the literature. They wanted to examine the literature on simulation-based training in the allied health professions of paramedics and EMTs, and in that, including usage trends and their potential impact on the professions and the patients they serve. So a couple of things here. One is I'd like to bring David to help us kind of walk through what a systematic review actually is, and why do we care about reviewing things that other people have already done.
Yeah, so if you think of the pyramid of sort of what the best research could be, a well-done systematic review is really at the very top of the best ways to say, this is a very evidence-based approach of ranking the best evidence available and saying, this is what's out there today about this topic. And a well-done systematic review will use a grade methodology, which is part of a consensus group called Cochrane that kind of said, okay, these are the ways in which we're going to rank the evidence. And if it's a multi-center trial with a large population of either patients or students, and had a, has a very strong recommendation, so results that are very, very impactful, then it rises to a higher grade. And this grade methodology is not only grading and assessing, but also developing and educating, and it's an acronym actually. So groups of experts systematically search the literature, which is where the word systematic comes from, and you decide a time period, in this case 2010 to 2021, decide which databases you're going to search, and what studies you're going to include. So in this case, they exclude anything with a student, and actually only included US and Canadian studies. So when we get to the discussion, that's a little pointy peak. I love the comment from Bill Toon. I'm not going to run with scissors and stab myself, but there are some issues here where they excluded large groups of studies, especially from Australia and the UK, that could have been quite helpful in this discussion. And so you decide, okay, we're going to include this, and then authors do just a title and abstract search. So you call every possible word search that the search engines help you find. And then once you've got that, you have to decide, okay, this was about nurses, or this is about, they use the word simulation, but it's not really actually what we were looking for. And eventually end with a group of more full article reads. There's software that helps you categorize and have multiple reviewers eventually agree to include, exclude, and eventually be able to share that. And in this case, they used EndNote. I use Mendeley because, and other people use Zotero, just to organize your library of hundreds and hundreds of papers that you're going to be either pulling down or looking at. And once you've really ran them, in EMS, we're really familiar with ACLS and AHA saying, okay, this is a class 1 or a best evidence available, strong evidence that this really actually changes outcomes in patients. So in education, it would be the same thing. If we know that there's a particular technique or some study that really showed outcomes had improved in graduates, and that's how we would end up with a table and a description of each one of these articles and what they lend. And sometimes that yields a conclusion like, if you were to do it probably on, I'm going to just go my friend Bill a little bit and say, if you did intubation and cardiac arrest today, you probably would come out with an answer that says doesn't matter. Do you do intubation versus supraglottic? Because you take the aggregate number of all the studies and say, oh, based on this and these large studies, these small studies, this is a well done study, this was just retrospective, and eventually you get to okay, based on that, these hundreds of thousands of patients or tens of thousands really benefited from this, or not really. It just didn't matter. It wasn't a big difference. And in this case, they flirt with the concept of systematic review. I think probably, and they registered this trial, which is a really good thing to do. When people are doing systematic reviews, registering, and there's a couple of different registries where you can say, here's my methodology, here's what I'm doing, and then report it, and use standardized methods like Prisma to report how you did it. So if somebody else came along and did the same thing, you would get the same results. So sort of the recipe for success and reproducibility, and it just means you're a more serious scientist if you've really published the way that you did it in such a way that it could be reproduced. There are some issues with the way this particular one was done. So the methods really, begin with the end in mind, and if you're talking about the recipe, if you really mess up the recipe, the end result is that the meal might be kind of bland, and this meal is pretty bland, in my opinion. So when you begin to decide and what's important or how to rank it, you may automatically find yourself in a category of well, if you only look at that, of course it's going to come out the way you thought it would. So hopefully that frames this particular type of systematic review. This is probably more in the vein of a scoping review, and the terminology is actually important because scoping reviews do not evaluate the scientific rigor of each study and then rank them against each other and aggregate. They come up with more themes and what was studied and what is perhaps the identification of a gap. And many PhD students, particularly paramedicine students in Australia, PhD students would have to do either a scoping or a systematic review. Scoping reviews are more liberal. You can include articles and you can do searches on Google and explore branches of a topic without having to have them meet a more scientific, rigorous. They had to be published in an indexed journal that appears on the National Library of Medicine or PubMed. So it gives you a little bit more freedom, and the advantage is that you're including and describing a little bit of a wider swath of what is, what you intended. Systematic reviews, if you really are tightly, focused, you might actually come up with 0, and then you probably shouldn't do the systematic review. In this case, they included the concept of patient outcome, which they measured as a study that would have shown them length of stay. And we can discuss whether that's actually a good way to measure patient outcome or not. That's up for debate. But by doing so, they were really focusing on studies by practicing paramedics and EMTs. And that's great if you have studies that did that. Now, they had none. And so that's a good thing to publish in the literature, to say no one has done that, at least in the US and Canada. And yet it might be helpful, if that's one of your criteria, to reference maybe nursing or other allied health professions that did do that and that did show that simulation mattered. So it's an interesting introduction that's really based on committee on accreditation issues and student type simulation concepts, except that the systematic review was on clinicians, and there are data from other professions saying this is linked to outcomes. So kind of a mix and match that doesn't work in the methods here. At least it didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And by the way, Bill Toon and I like to rib each other, but Bill really should talk about the phenomenal job they did at MedAct when they enacted a battalion chief, an educator is a battalion chief who takes simulation on the road and brings it to the first responders and the paramedics together to both remediate or refresh or really address a QI issue and improve. And so in the science of quality improvement that today, Alex Tremblay will be very eloquent to be able to describe, that concept of pinpointing a particular behavior we can rehearse and prepare for high fidelity, high acuity and high fidelity simulation for low frequency types of cases is a very useful intervention, very lasting intervention.
Yeah, I wonder if, Bill, if you have any thoughts about, there's one thing to run continuing education simulations. It's another to publish them. So they're looking for actually publications. What do you have any feedback on that? What takes somebody to say, okay, I'm running this continuing education, now I'm going to publish it, unless there's a physician there who has a requirement?
No, I think that's the crux when you're dealing with EMS research, is we don't have access to the funding. It would have been great if we had taken our experience and written it all up and published it, so it was not a big secret to the rest of the world. So I'm not familiar with similar to what we did that I've seen published and stuff. But I think there's a lot of agencies that do something similar to what we did, or probably even do something better than what we did. But ours was very much tied, again, towards the end of my tenure there. We tried to tie as much of what we were doing related to trying to correct something found in QI. Mm-hmm. And so we would get something from the medical director that said, we need to focus on this. And then in between there, we always had also focused on the low frequency, high acuity skills were also mixed into there, of also trying to cover our, cover our CQI concerns. The other thing I know that since I've left there is they do credentialing, and I'm not sure how they do that.
Yeah. So, and it's when, Alex, you're also in QI. So I'm wondering if you have any feedback about the idea of, is this we see more and more QI being published, by the way, in the form of, in research. And it's one of those QI research there, the crossroads there. And I'm wondering if you have any comment on that, on experience there.
Yeah, quality improvement is just the research scientific method kind of simplified and flattened out for a business purpose, right? And that's really that's the thing that brings me back to work every day, is continuous improvement. It's a lot easier to say, hey, we saw this problem, we did this, we fixed this problem, and now here's where we're at. The thing that's good here, and the thing that has to be considered long term, is your intervention, your test and your subsequent improvement is usually fleeting, right? 90 days per improvement is kind of what you anticipate, even with a locked in process. So, hey, listen, now we're going to only tape the end title to the laryngoscope handle so that you can't forget it or whatever. Eventually people just get used to untaping the end title and moving it, right? So this is a really great example of start, and then continue, and like, how do you lock that in? And what we found at the service is that simulation was the way that we locked it in, right? And especially by moving to something like, we had a HAL when I left that role full time was really what did it. So that's QI in a nutshell.
Yeah. So going back to what David said, starting with the end in mind, kind of backwards mapping. And when I think about QI, and you see presentations on a best practice that someone has done, that a change that they've implemented into their system, and they've seen certain outcomes, and they present it at a conference. It's more like showcasing your system, showcasing an example. Maybe they'll take it to publication, but it seems like it's an area ripe for something like action research, where you have, groups of people that are just continuously going through this cycle of improvement that ultimately affects the community. So, David?
Yeah, in this context, and I think a lot of us are familiar with resuscitation science, that really, the reason AHA had a practice while you watch, and then went to some of the classic studies around, if you can, do CPR in this way, there's going to be an outcome that's improved, and let's simulate this and see how long people retain those skills. It was surprising to me in this paper that resuscitation science, that has been very well published and very popular around, if you have people simulate this way, you will actually produce patient outcomes that are survival to discharge, that in their search, this doesn't really come up. And so again, we're talking about methods right now, and we're talking about how to systematically include or exclude papers. And in the case of, if you're thinking about, simulation, the process of doing a cardiac arrest, and what does that result in, that could have been very powerful in this particular set of methods, but I didn't see it. Or at least they didn't describe it, or describe why they would have excluded it. And that leaves questions in my mind about, did they capture all the ways in which we have simulated and use simulation? Because they describe it very well. I really like the way they say, look, this is high fidelity. Simulation can be anything from, can you do a task, to can you put it all together? Okay. So if you're describing all of these methods of simulation, then which one were you really interested in? And I really appreciate the fact that they're often describing what we would call this obsession with checklists. Not that I think checklists are great, but the concept of a motor skill that is rote memorization of a kind of a non-realistic, non-actual list of processes, versus a checklist that's based on safety and outcome. And when they describe those protocol-driven, did you tick the boxes kind of checklists, there's just, they did find a lot of what, we would expect, which is there's that driver to do simulation that says you met the protocol. So I really like what some people have been doing around culture of safety and outcome, and saying, it doesn't matter if you give them oxygen or not, or nitro or not, if you don't give a STEMI, aspirin, 12 lead in a cath lab, those are the three things that actually matter. So you can have long checklists that don't matter. And the description in this study is really great about why we tend to be task oriented and not necessarily outcome oriented. And I really like that about these methods.
Yeah. So looking at the table here, then you can see that we're just getting to the results, and then Katie, I'd like to hear from you. So just looking here, after they've identified and gone through their screening and eligibility criteria, and then they come down to the full text articles that they're going to use. They assessed 42 for eligibility, 20 got excluded for not relevant countries, which will be an interesting comment. I'd like to hear from from you guys on that in a little bit. I think you mentioned it. And then they use an N of 25 to evaluate. I did not, of course, include the gigantic table that you usually see in a systematic review, which has the breakdown of everything from author and study and purpose and population and design, intervention, and study setting the results, and then a risk of bias assessment, which is something that David mentioned earlier. Katie.
Yeah, just listening to Dave talk about some of the things that got excluded. Obviously, we're like huge countries and parts of the world that do a lot of paramedic research or EMS research, but we also seem to have missed anything related to disaster sim or SimX, which is actually huge in the publishing area, right? Like, so we see a lot of disaster simulations that are published. And I think it's probably something related to the terms that they used, but that's an area where EMS is actually doing a lot of sim, right? So we're thinking about like active shooter sims, mass casualty sims, and maybe it's because we can't really link to patient outcomes, but that might be where it got excluded. I just thought it was really interesting that when we think about EMS, we usually like kind of forget that we're emergency, and we think about medicine because we do so many non-emergency things, which came up in this study, but that whole like actual emergency, like disaster, didn't even come up here. So we lost our E, it seems like, a lot.
And to the point that you made, the terms, they did print in here all of the terms, the specific search terms. So you could, I actually appreciate when people either put in the appendix and a link, or they put it directly in the article if they have the editorial space. All of the search terms, they put it all in. So you could actually kind of go through and critique based upon looking at their search terms that they used and the databases that they used, and then their exclusion criteria as well. So there is an error on this figure that we pointed out. Somebody pointed out before we came on today, which is the color scheme at the bottom of the legend is does not match what is above. But this is the pie chart that shows how many what the studies that they had, which was 25 of them, who were the subjects that were they were looking at, which was most were just paramedic. 16 out of 25, then 8 out of 25 were paramedic and EMT, and only one article involved just EMT. So, and the articles by simulation focus, general assessment and treatment, airway management, and resuscitation were up there as the top. And then other was a category, and other included, and this is in their article, care planning, drug administration, and transport. So I'm going to assume that's one of each there. And then imaging, and I'm not sure exactly whether that was sonography or what. I'm not sure if I picked that up in there. But this is just sort of the general breakdown of the focus of the articles, the personnel and the focus. And then they broke down the common features within the articles. And this is where it dawned on me, it took me during the first read, that they were not talking about initial education, even though it's right in the title. It took me a minute because the minute they brought up the COA, I thought, oh, maybe we're talking about education. But the study setting was the one that surprised me. I don't know how you guys felt about this, but the study setting mobile simulation lab or unit kind of surprised me. And then we had this discussion before about the study setting and mobile simulation labs. So Kim, I wonder if you can come on and you are over a number of different level programs. And do you use this mobile simulation lab and unit?
At this point, we don't. We are stationary, but we have had conversations. Actually, so I'm in Colorado, and so we actually have had conversations in Colorado about using or developing mobile simulation as in a cooperative between initial education and continuing education, so that we could integrate that the concept actually that was discussed earlier to ensure that our continuing education practitioners would have access to well-developed simulation activities. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important as we talk about simulation is that gone are the days that we throw a mannequin on the floor and run the call that we ran last night without objectives or outcomes that have been developed beforehand. And so I think that we have to have a defined definition of what simulation is, and simulation isn't necessarily high fidelity or low fidelity. I think simulation is the development of the educational activity.
Thank you. That's, thunderous applause to that comment. Which I think, the whole idea of the educational, institutions, programs where you have educators that are focused solely on the education component and the process and the procedure and the definition of simulation, and then, feed that into the system. I think that's a great idea. Mike?
I'm thrilled they included some simulation buses. We had one of these when I was at the University of Iowa. It was an old Winnebago, and we used to drive it across the state. I would echo what Kimberly said. You still have the great educational methods that go into simulation. I'm going to see if I can find it. There's a couple of grants that are actually out there to help fund simulation labs like this for rural EMS. There's actually one still going on in the state of Iowa, so I'm going to see if I put it in the chat. But I will say it's a blast driving a Winnebago across the state of Iowa to do simulation with EMS providers. If you get an opportunity to do that in your area, it's a ton of fun.
I noticed there are a ton of experts on this particular audience. First of all, great to see so many people tune in. Obviously, the simulation was a hot topic, but don't be afraid to use the chat area to kind of share your expertise, just like Chris Ryther did. And I see Anthony Gurney here and others that are PCRF associates that have experience doing research in this particular area. So the cursory, what Kimberly just said is just so incredibly important, and that is, people just assume throw the mannequin on the ground, come up with a scenario, and then go. And if you don't have access to a library of well-developed scenarios that are really have objectives that have particular learning outcomes tied to them, then reach out and actually use some of the things that have already been developed or formats that have been developed, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I wouldn't be me if I wouldn't say, put a shameless plug into the National Association of EMTs certification courses like PHTLS, AMLS, CPC, courses that have developed hundreds of scenarios that are impossible to do in 2 days. So it's really about, a library of scenarios that are useful, that have specific teaching points, and really just naming the environment. So I love the Winnebago across Iowa. If we know what we're teaching, and if we have enough frequency and access to this tool. And so I get very nervous. In Minnesota, we saw a great, I don't know, there were 3 or 4 of these big semi trailers, and I see the value of bringing it to a hospital and having all the staff work on a particular piece of it. But I also know that getting a license to drive the semi and actually paying somebody to learn to use the simulation equipment and move it is hard. And in our world and in the audience that I'm used to working with, educators need to scrounge, and I would use the back of an ambulance before I tried to figure out a semi, because that's where we work. And so using our really what is it that we're after would be great. Also, Megan, they talk about virtual simulation, and I thought it was interesting that they didn't find any studies regarding the use of virtual simulation, which is a gap that I really like, that they said we should do a bit of this, because you're talking about rural, you talk about access, talk about getting the highest education we can into difficult to reach areas. And we should be thinking not just about the resources like high fidelity mannequins getting there, but rather how can we use what we have already and supplement with, more well orchestrated virtual pieces.
I think they missed a few. There's been several augmented. We actually have looked at a few of them on this show. So, and next time we're going to be looking at augmented reality. So, I think they missed a few by definitely not including Australia, because Australia's done a few pretty innovative things with virtual simulation and others. So, yeah, that some of that may have been the product of the search. Alex?
Megan, they didn't say why, right? I was just reviewing my notes quick. They didn't explain why they only chose those two countries, right?
They didn't, but you know what? I'm thinking now too. I'm thinking back to what I just said, and that was initial education again. So this is not initial education, so they're missing on that too. So the use of virtual and augmented reality, in practicing paramedics and EMTs, I think you're going to get different results here if you look at initial education programs as well.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about what Dave said earlier about how like systematic reviews, meta-analyses are really the top tier of research. They're the top tier of research if they're looking usually at like double-blinded research controlled trials. They have to be really strong, and they also have to cast a wide net. And I think my biggest challenge here is that this is a very narrow net to start.
Yeah.
It's good. It's a great foundational research. It's just I miss the why in that respect.
Yeah. And then Mike, can you make a comment about EMT level? Is it just not studied? I mean, this is just not published, not studied, because we know it's used.
I don't know. I'm reading this the same way. Like I would echo, like I did my master's thesis in MCI education, and there's tons of simulations out there on MCIs that I looked through and I didn't see any of them. So I think there is simulation EMT education. I think we can all agree there's probably not enough as there should be. But I think there's definitely simulation going on. I'll echo what everyone else has said, which is this doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be expensive. You don't need the mobile sim lab in the parking lot necessarily. In fact, I was just watching a graduation video and our immersive classroom showed up. They were running a simulation on the beach where we were projecting on the walls, but you can do it even easier. Bring in some former students, run a cardiac arrest. We focus a lot more simulation for EMTs, not on the skills, but on the affective domain, trying to get them to deliver, to communicate with patients. And in that younger 18 to 24 demographic that we see a lot of EMT students, they're still building those skills of how to communicate with their partner, with their team, with family members. I thought it was great. I saw Dan Batsy's on here. I stole a simulation from him because he shared it at a conference about talking to a patient whose only complaint was that they wanted to cancel their Meals on Wheels for the day because you were taken to the hospital and last time some animals got into it. We run that and talk about how important it is to take care of your patient's medical complaints, but also the other things that are going on in their life. So I think it's huge. It's easy to do, and we probably need more of it, but we probably also just don't study it. There's probably nothing published on it because we're too busy trying to get them to assemble the oxygen tank while trying to get them to deliver, good therapeutic communication.
Katie, thunderous applause.
Yeah, I can't say this enough. Like even in this article, the things that are in the chart, they're focusing on a mannequin or not a mannequin and like a simulate patient. And some of the ways that they're talking about Fidelity here are just equipment focused. And Fidelity has such a different meaning depending on what the learning objective is. And we can just see this comment on skills and the can you put a laryngoscope in the right place, right? And we're also focused on that. It's important. Get it. Airway is important. We just had this horrible fallout with an unrecognized esophageal intubation. Get it. But what we do 90% of the time is not that. And we're really not focusing that on training. We don't see it. They mentioned the COA here. We don't see it in the SMC coming from the COA, where can you cancel someone's Meals on Wheels? How many sims did you run of that? So I just want to jump on with Cadus and say we should be researching that. We should be counting it. And we should be focusing our studies around what we do.
Go ahead, Kim.
I was going to say, one of the things that I think we should do as an industry, as a discipline, I think discipline's better than industry, is we number one, I think we all need to speak the same language, and that's not something that we do. I think we need to, our skills focus is deliberate practice. And so we have our students work, right? Somebody's going to take 5 times to get that right airway. Somebody's going to take 25 times to get that right airway. The students know, right? They know when they're ready. And I shouldn't tell them when they're going to be ready. Then we move into that scenario, right? And we have that with Appendix G, now SMC, right? But we should be using that language. We should be using the language instead of saying skills practice. We should be saying to our students, now you are going to use deliberate practice. And so that they're in that idea. And then when we move into simulation, when we do simulation, we are using the whole idea of a NASCL standards, the healthcare standards of best practice in simulation. And we should apply those in our scenarios and our deliberate practice. But if we are in the realm of simulation, I think that we should be meeting all of the simulation standards, or at least striving to meet those standards. And we should be doing that as a discipline across the nation. That's my 2 cents.
That's great. There's a book and a podcast that goes with it that's on simulation in healthcare education that talks a lot about the evidence. Is mostly centered on residents, but physicians have, paramedics and DMS providers have the same kind of workflow as an emergency physician. So these same principles apply, and they've done research that goes all the way out to patient outcome. Specifically with the outcomes of procedural skills like central line placement and the reduction on, they've actually gone all the way out to financial outcomes, to the return on investment, and found positive influence of deliberate practice, mastery learning, simulation-based mastery learning on central line placement, and not in just a mannequin insertion technique, but in an entire simulation. And then they did the kind of levels of outcomes, the translational outcomes, all the way out to length of stay in the hospital, like reduction of infections, which were apparently a serious issue, and then length of stay. That could be done. This could be done in something. So I'm really confident that we've got a few things on the horizon. One is a big study like the NCSBN study that helps us get at the simulation and clinical combination, and what any kind of recommendations we can make for programs in terms of percentages or whatever that can help states, right, with their regulations and with policy. And the other is some of these translational science outcomes that I think are on the horizon, step by step, but it starts with the initial education into the continuing education and beyond. So I love what you said, Kimberly, about the combination, and Alex and Katie and Michael about combining everything. So Katie.
Yeah, I think one of the things too is that we might be missing some of this because we don't see things as simulation. So I'm thinking about like there's a lot of studies from the ROC, the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, around if we should be using an iGel or a King airway or intubation, right? Those interventions, those studies, they had simulation training as part of the study for active paramedics before they use those devices, but we're not capturing that, right? So as a simulation intervention, but we're doing that. When we roll out the iGel, they do sim. They have to put the iGel in a mannequin head before they use the iGel in the field. But what we're publishing is, we implemented this iGel and the people are doing that. But we also added an intervention of simulation. So I think sometimes we're missing that too. And then just when we think about outcomes, I agree, length of stay is a great outcome measure and all of that. But if you look at like Paramedic 2 trial, outcome wasn't that you got a pulse back. It was that you have a neurologically intact survival. And I think sometimes we need to think about what's actually the outcome that we should be looking for. And if we're thinking about these effective things, maybe it's patient satisfaction surveys and scores, which are things that we do, right? That they are things we do in EMS. So maybe that could be one of the things we link to.
I couldn't agree more. I'm gonna make a very snobbish comment too, which I will qualify. So whenever I hope anybody's listening to this podcast, they're listening with the intent to perhaps duplicate the study or do research of their own or participate in this process to advance pre-hospital care with evidence and science. And I want to give kudos to Megan for finding this. Secondly, I want to give kudos to having it published, because I think if they would have just kept their process to themselves, then we wouldn't have had the benefit of learning some of the key pieces that they've elucidated. I also, the snobbish part of this comment is, this is a nascent journal that they published in, yes, which is great, right? So the International Journal of Paramedicine is brand spanking new, so new that it's not indexed yet. So, you know, the National Association of EMS Managers is sponsoring it and has people like me on the editorial board. So I'm part of this. When a journal is born, it needs material, and there's a good review process started. And Mick Gunderson was one of the people who started hospital disaster medicine, so he knows how to do a journal. And there's really good reasons to publish this. At the same time, the way that people rank journals and have impact on evidence is when people cite them and when what their findings are really well substantiated. So we are beginning this journey, which means we should read and contribute and participate, and also take with a grain of salt, because this is a unproven, you know, medium that we're beginning to explore.
Oh, this is great. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Alex, go ahead.
Dave, I just, to bounce off that, so to talk about unindexed journals, right? So in public administration, public policy, right now there's Journal of Social Equity and Public Policy that just started here in Minnesota. Really excited to see it get indexed in 2 years, right? One of the challenges, and we talked at the beginning about how there's just not a lot of EMS research. One of the challenges that we're going to have to overcome is the fact that acceptance rates in index journals that still use impact factors are hilariously low, right? So the American Review of Public Administration is a journal that I'm on the steering board for, not the editorial board. Their acceptance factor is 9.5%, right? So if we don't have research that, one, makes sense to practitioners and two, is applicable, and we're accepting at a rate of 9.5%, then we probably aren't putting out enough research. And people that read academic journals understand how to critique academic research, right? So you can't just read it and say, hey, look, this study said 4 milligrams of cardiac arrest is the best for everybody. The part of research is creating foundational research. And so again, same thing, really excited that this is out. But there's a problem that has to be fixed, which is how do we get more research in front of people in a way that makes sense, that is not happening right now and probably is holding back some EMS advancement.
The accessibility alone, right, David? The accessibility alone we talk about. We always say we want to make it more accessible, but there's the paywall.
Yeah. You know, everyone on this and every listener to this should be looking at Rebecca Cash's latest publication, because she did a great job of showing there is EMS research, it is improving, and to Alex's point, the articles that get rejected from PEC are automatically going to the IJP, this new International Journal of Paramedicine. So they're in the flow of those rejects, quote unquote, which sometimes are not rejects. They're great studies. They just aren't really appropriate for that venue or not. So it does matter. It is growing, and we should support it. And at the same time, we need to be indexed. It's really, really important to actually go through the steps to do the thing right.
This is great. Anybody have anything more to say? We're right at the hour, and I want to make sure that we let people go back to their business. But any final comments from anyone?
Do more sim.
And remember to contact the PCRF if you need any help with anything. We have mentors standing by. All right. I want to special. Of course, Bill has one thing to say. Go ahead.
No, just it probably, we with this podcast may need to maybe every several months or a couple of times a year really need to make sure we're looking at the research dealing with simulation and bring it here to this audience, because I'll still say that, and Kim touched on this before, we lack a common language, particularly amongst EMS educators, even lack a common a common terminology around simulation. So we need to continue to build the competency in our EMS educators to really be able to embrace simulation and get all the benefits that can come out of it.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And Kim, can you just come on and tell us, can we find your dissertation anywhere yet?
Yes, it is published through the
Request or one of those.
Look at the Scholar Works, but I'm happy to send it to anyone that would like to spend their time reading it.
And where can they find you?
I'll put my email in the chat.
Great.
I also, as I am sitting here espousing that everyone needs to publish, I also need to summarize my dissertation findings and work to get them published.
Great. Great. We look forward to that. And thank you very much for joining us today. Good luck with everything you're doing. Yeah, we'd love to have you again, especially when we're talking about simulation. So thank you everyone for joining us today. PCRF Education Research Journal Club. We will be back September 22nd live from New Orleans at the EMS World Expo. We're going to be live again. This is going to be so much fun. And we're back talking about simulation. Pre-hospital pediatric emergency training using augmented reality simulation, a prospective mixed method study. This is in PEC. It is open access 2023. You can pull it. And our next journal club with Dr. Remley Crow, Dr. Tony Fernandez is Monday, September 11th. So you can join them earlier than our next podcast here. Remember to join us live each month. You can register at prehospitalcare.org. And you can find our archives on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@PCRF@UCLA. And thank you everyone for joining us. See you next time.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at www.pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF@UCLA and on our website at www.prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsor, Limmer Education, providing education tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey.